A cruel woman steals an orphan's drawing. What happens years later changes everything. The orphanage was always cold, not just from the drafty stone walls, but from the way life inside it drained the warmth from every child who passed through its doors. David had learned early on that silence was his best defense. He never caused trouble, never spoke out of turn, and never dared to step beyond the invisible lines drawn by the rigid rules of the institution. But there was one thing that made him feel alive, one thing that gave him color in a world of dull grays: his drawings. He had discovered his love for sketching before he even knew how to write his own name. Every stolen moment, every scrap of paper he could find, became a canvas for his imagination. It was the only thing that belonged to him, the only thing they couldn't take away. Or so he thought. One morning, as the children sat hunched over their wooden desks, Sister Margaret, the headmistress, prowled through the room like a vulture circling prey. She was a woman of sharp angles, sharp nose, sharp voice, sharp temper, and she had made it her mission to crush any spark of individuality from the children under her care. When her shadow fell over David's desk, he instinctively clutched the edges of his latest drawing, a vibrant depiction of a house with a rainbow stretching across the sky. It was a dream, a hope, something beyond the orphanage walls. But before he could hide it, her claw-like fingers snatched it away. "What is this?" she sneered, holding the drawing up for the class to see. Laughter rippled through the room, but David barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He didn't answer. He knew better than to speak when her voice had that sharp edge. "Foolishness," she spat, crumpling the paper in her hands. "No one wants the scribbles of an orphan." Tears burned behind David's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. She didn't just throw his drawing away. She took it with her, tucking it under her arm as if it were hers. He wanted to protest, to demand it back, but he knew the consequences of defiance. Instead, he watched as she walked away, his one piece of happiness disappearing into the folds of her dark dress. Years passed, but David never forgot. He grew older, wiser, and with time, he escaped the orphanage and built a life of his own. His love for art never faded. He studied, worked tirelessly, and eventually, he became what no one in that orphanage would have ever imagined: a renowned artist. His paintings hung in galleries, his work admired by people who would never know the boy who once sat in a cold orphanage, dreaming of something better. Then one evening, at a prestigious exhibition in a city far from the shadows of his past, something stopped him cold. A painting. But not just any painting. His painting. The same rainbow, the same house, the same childish lines that he had drawn all those years ago. But there, in the bottom right corner, was a signature that wasn't his. Sister Margaret's name was scrawled across the canvas, claiming his work as her own. Anger coiled in his chest, but beneath it was something colder: determination. He tracked her down, not to seek revenge, but to reclaim what was his. She was no longer the powerful woman who had once ruled his life with cruelty. Time had withered her into a frail figure, but the sharpness in her eyes remained. When he stood before her, she barely recognized him, but when he placed the stolen drawing on the table between them, her expression faltered. "This belongs to me," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. She stared at him, silent for a long moment before she scoffed. "It was just a drawing." "It was never just a drawing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It was my dream. And you stole it." For the first time, she had no response. He took the drawing, turned, and walked away, leaving her in the dim light of her small, empty home. She had spent her life taking from others, but in the end, she had nothing. Meanwhile, he had built something she could never take away: his own name, his own success, and his own destiny. David didn't look back as he walked away from Sister Margaret's house. The cold night air wrapped around him, but inside, he burned with emotions he couldn't quite name. He had won. He had taken back what was his. And yet, the victory felt hollow. He expected satisfaction, maybe even relief, but all he felt was a quiet, unsettled feeling deep in his chest. He had spent years carrying the weight of that stolen moment, the humiliation, the helplessness. Now he had reclaimed what was his, but it didn't change the past. It didn't erase the years of doubt, the nights he stayed awake wondering if he would ever be more than the orphan boy with broken dreams. The next morning, he stared at the old drawing, now carefully smoothed out and placed on his desk. The lines were faded, the paper wrinkled with time, but it was still his. His first dream, his first glimpse of a world beyond what he had known. His fingers traced the familiar strokes, the way the colors had blended together, unrefined but full of hope. He should put it away, tuck it into a folder and move on, but something in him refused to let it go. Later that afternoon, his assistant, Marie, knocked on his studio door. "David, you need to see this," she said, her voice tight with urgency. She held up her phone, the screen glowing with a news article. His heart sank the moment he saw it. Renowned artist accuses former orphanage headmistress of art theft. His jaw tightened as he skimmed the article. Someone had leaked the confrontation. It detailed how he had confronted Sister Margaret, how she had stolen his work, how she had claimed it as her own. The media had latched onto the story like wolves scenting fresh blood. "I didn't tell anyone about this," he murmured, his mind racing. Marie gave him a cautious look. "Then someone else did. Maybe someone in the gallery? People were watching when you saw the painting, David." David exhaled sharply. He had never intended to make this public. He had wanted to close a chapter, not start a new battle. She responded, Marie said, scrolling down to another article. His eyes narrowed. "What?" Marie turned the screen toward him, and he read the words slowly, disbelief washing over him. "Former headmistress denies accusations. That boy always lied. He was nothing before me." His fingers curled into fists. That boy. He wasn't even a person to her. Not then. Not now. Marie hesitated. "This is going viral, David. People are choosing sides. Some believe you. Others," she exhaled. "Others are defending her, saying you should just let it go." Of course. The world was full of people who would rather believe the one in power. David stood, running a hand through his hair. He had a choice to make. He could ignore it. Let the headlines fade. Let the world forget. Or he could finish this. That evening, he sat in front of a blank canvas. For the first time in years, he painted not for a gallery, not for a commission, but for himself. The strokes were bold, the colors raw, the emotions woven into every detail. He painted the orphanage, dark and looming in the background. He painted the small boy at the desk, clutching his stolen drawing, his eyes filled with silent defiance. And he painted her, towering over him, her hands gripping the paper like a prize she hadn't earned. But this time, he painted something new. He painted the boy standing up. The next morning, the painting was displayed in the heart of his gallery with one title: The Truth. The media exploded. The public turned. People who had once doubted him saw what they had ignored for so long. The power imbalance, the way those with control took from those who had none. The painting spoke louder than any article, louder than any interview. And when Sister Margaret saw it, she knew. She had lost. But David? David had won in the only way that mattered. Not with revenge, but with his art, his truth, his voice. And this time, no one could ever take it away. The days following the unveiling of the truth were a storm unlike anything David had ever experienced. The painting had ignited something far beyond the art world. It wasn't just a work of art, it was a symbol, a statement. People who had never stepped foot in a gallery before flocked to see it. News outlets dissected its meaning, psychologists weighed in on its emotional depth, and former orphans, not just from David's past but from orphanages around the world, began sharing their own stories. And then came the investigations. At first, Sister Margaret had tried to dismiss it all as a bitter lie from a nobody who had gotten lucky. She went on a talk show, her face aged but her eyes still full of that same sharp cruelty, and claimed David had always been an attention-seeking child. He had an overactive imagination, she told the host with a dismissive wave of her hand. He was always making up stories. I tried to guide him, to make him see the real world, but some children are simply ungrateful. David watched the interview from his studio, his jaw tightening as she spun the narrative the same way she had when he was a child. He could see it in her expression, She truly believed she had done nothing wrong, that she had a right to take, to shape, to own whatever she wanted. But this time, the world wasn't listening to her. This time, the world was listening to him. In the following days, more former students came forward. People who had been in that same orphanage decades before and after him. People who had stories of cruelty, of punishments that left invisible scars, of stolen dreams and crushed spirits. The tide shifted. It wasn't just about a painting anymore. It was about justice. The orphanage was put under official investigation. Reports surfaced of mismanaged funds, unexplained donations, lost paperwork on adoptions that never should have happened. Sister Margaret wasn't just an old woman who had once mistreated children. She was a thief, and now, people were starting to realize it. David received a call from a journalist, eager for a direct interview, but he declined. He had already told his truth. Now, he just had to watch as justice finally caught up to her. One evening, as he was closing up his gallery, the bell above the door chimed. He turned, expecting Marie or one of the staff, but instead, standing in the entrance, was her Sister Margaret. She looked smaller than he remembered, her once intimidating presence now reduced to a frail woman with hunched shoulders. But her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same. David crossed his arms, waiting. She stepped forward, the sound of her shoes against the wooden floor strangely hollow. "You've made quite a mess, David." He tilted his head. "Funny. I was about to say the same to you." Her lips pursed. "This was unnecessary. Love it. You could have just let the past stay where it belongs." David let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You still don't get it, do you?" Her expression hardened. "You spent your life controlling people," he continued. "Taking what wasn't yours, deciding whose voice mattered. But you never expected that one day, the people you stepped on would stand back up." She scoffed. "You think you've won? You think you've accomplished something?" David met her gaze, calm and unwavering. "I didn't think it. I know it." For the first time, she faltered. She swallowed, her hands clenching at her sides. "You've destroyed me." David stared at her, and for a moment he almost felt pity. Almost. But then he remembered the years of silence, the way she had stolen the only thing that had ever made him feel alive, the way she had stolen from so many others, and the pity disappeared. "No," he said. "You destroyed yourself." Her face twisted in fury, but she had nothing left to say. And this time, he was the one to walk away. The fallout came fast. Within weeks, Sister Margaret was officially charged with fraud, child endangerment, and embezzlement. The orphanage she had once run so ruthlessly was permanently shut down, and the government opened an investigation into similar institutions across the country. David didn't celebrate. This wasn't about revenge. This was about truth. One day, months after it was all over, he received a letter. It was from a young artist, just 13 years old. "Dear Mr. David, I saw your painting, The Truth, at the gallery. I never knew that art could tell a story like that. I never knew that paintings could be more than just pretty pictures. I want to be an artist too. I want to paint things that matter. Thank you for showing me that's possible." David smiled, folding the letter carefully and tucking it away. That was what mattered. Not the downfall of one cruel woman, but the fact that her power had been replaced with something greater. With hope. With voices that would never be silenced again. And this time, no one would steal their dreams. David sat in his studio late into the night, staring at The Truth, the painting that had changed everything. It was strange, the way life had unfolded. He had never sought revenge. He had only wanted what was his. And yet, in reclaiming his stolen childhood, he had set into motion something much larger than himself. Justice had been served, Sister Margaret had faced the consequences of her actions, and the orphanage that had once been a place of misery was gone. But even now, after everything, he felt restless. The world had seen the truth. It had started conversations, unearthed corruption, and given voices to those who had been silenced for so long. But was it enough? Could it ever be enough? He pulled out the letter from the young artist, running his fingers over the words. "I want to paint things that matter." David smiled, a slow realization settling over him. Maybe that was what he needed to do next. The next morning, he called a meeting with his team. Marie was the first to arrive, coffee in hand, giving him a knowing look. "You're up to something," she said before even sitting down. David chuckled. "You know me too well." "I do. So what's next?" He took a deep breath. "We're going to start something new. A foundation. A space for young artists, kids who never had the opportunities one did, kids from orphanages, foster homes, shelters. We'll give them supplies, mentors, a place to create." Marie's eyes widened, then a slow smile spread across her face. "You want to build something that lasts?" David nodded. "I want to make sure no one else ever has to fight to be heard the way I did." Word spread fast. Within weeks, investors and donors lined up to support the Markov Foundation for Art and Expression. It wasn't just a charity, it was a movement. Schools partnered with them, galleries offered their spaces, and artists from around the world volunteered their time to mentor the next generation. At the opening ceremony, David stood before a crowd of young artists, each of them holding their own sketchpads, pencils, and paints. He looked at them and saw himself in their eager faces. "This place exists because art is more than just images on a canvas," he said. "It's our voice, our truth. No one should ever be told their dreams don't matter." A young girl raised her hand, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Mr. David, do you still have your first drawing?" David smiled, reaching into his bag. He unfolded the old, wrinkled paper, the rainbow, the house, the dream of something better. "I do," he said, holding it up for them to see. "And now, it's exactly where it belongs." The children clapped, and David felt something settle in his chest. This was it. This was what the truth had led him to. Not just exposing the past, but creating a future where dreams couldn't be stolen. And as the children picked up their brushes, filling the walls with color, David knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The Markov Foundation for Art and Expression took off faster than David had ever anticipated. What had started as a simple idea, a safe space for children to create without fear of their work being stolen or dismissed, had become something much bigger. Within weeks, donations poured in from artists, philanthropists, and even celebrities who had heard about his story. Schools reached out, wanting to introduce art therapy programs based on his foundation's mission. Galleries offered space to showcase the children's work. But success came with pressure. David found himself pulled in 100 different directions. He was still painting, still creating, but now he was also managing a movement. Every day was filled with meetings, planning sessions, and calls with investors. He barely had time to sit in front of a canvas anymore. And then came the letters. At first, they were just small notes from children who had been inspired by the truth. But soon, they became something else. Source: hundreds of letters, each carrying the weight of a child's unspoken pain. Some from former orphans like him, who had once believed their dreams were worthless. Others from children currently trapped in systems designed to break them rather than lift them up. One letter in particular stuck with him. It was from a boy named Daniel, barely 10 years old, living in a foster home notorious for mistreatment. His words were shaky, his handwriting uneven, but the message was clear. "I draw because it makes me feel like I exist, like I matter. But sometimes I wonder if I really do." David read the letter over and over again, his chest tightening. He recognized those feelings, the quiet despair of wondering if anyone would ever see you. And suddenly, everything felt different. The foundation wasn't just about giving children a place to create. It was about giving them a voice, a reason to believe that their dreams were worth something. David sat at his desk that night, staring at a blank canvas. It had been weeks since he had painted for himself, but now he picked up his brush and let his emotions pour out. The colors bled together, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't about technique or perfection, it was about truth. About the feeling of being unseen. About the fear of disappearing. About the power of reclaiming your own story. When it was finished, he stepped back. The painting was different from anything he had ever done. It wasn't grand or polished. It was simple. A child sitting alone in a vast, empty space, his hands gripping a piece of paper as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded in the world. He titled it Daniel. The next day, he sent a copy of the painting to the boy, along with a note. "You matter. Your art matters. Keep drawing." Weeks passed, and then, one afternoon, David received a reply. Daniel's handwriting was still shaky, but this time, his words carried something new. "I showed my drawing to my teacher. She told me I should keep going. I think I want to be an artist too." David smiled, exhaling deeply. This was why he had started all of this. Not for headlines. Not for revenge. But for kids like Daniel. For himself. For the boy he had once been. The boy who had lost so much, only to find that his art was the one thing no one could ever take away from him again. As the months passed, the foundation grew beyond what David had imagined. New locations opened across the country, providing underprivileged children access to art, mentorship, and most importantly, a community that believed in them. Then one evening, as David prepared to close the studio for the night, Marie walked in, holding an envelope. "You need to see this," she said, handing it to him. David frowned, flipping it open. Inside was a formal invitation to an awards ceremony in Paris. The International Art Guild was recognizing his work, not just as an artist, but as a changemaker. He let out a slow breath, staring at the letter. "You deserve this," Marie said softly. David looked up, a small smile playing at his lips. "You know, for the longest time, I thought proving Sister Margaret wrong would be my greatest achievement." Marie smirked. "And now?" He exhaled. "Now I know that proving myself right was what really mattered." She clapped a hand on his shoulder. "So, are you going to Paris?" David hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yes." The night of the awards ceremony was surreal. David stood in a grand hall, surrounded by some of the most influential figures in the art world. But for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like an outsider. He wasn't the orphan boy anymore. He wasn't the child whose work had been stolen. He was David Markov, and he had built something that mattered. As he stepped onto the stage to accept his award, he took a deep breath. "This isn't just for me," he said, his voice steady. "This is for every child who was told they weren't enough. For every dream that was dismissed. For every voice that was silenced." The applause was deafening. And as he looked out into the sea of faces, he realized something. He had spent years chasing closure. But in the end, he had found something far greater. Not an ending, but a new beginning. David returned from Paris feeling like he had stepped into a new chapter of his life. The award wasn't just a recognition of his art, it was a statement, a confirmation that the world had seen him, that his voice mattered. For the first time in a long time, he felt free from the weight of his past. Yet, despite the celebrations, despite the success of the foundation, there was something gnawing at him, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. Back at his studio, he found himself staring at the truth, the painting that had ignited everything. He had moved on, or at least, that's what he told himself, but some part of him felt unfinished. It wasn't about Sister Margaret anymore. She was gone, her influence reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. It wasn't even about proving himself. He had done that. Then what was it? Marie noticed the shift in him almost immediately. "You've been quiet since Paris," she said one afternoon, setting down a stack of letters from children who had benefited from the foundation. "What's going on?" David exhaled. "I don't know." Marie crossed her arms, waiting. She had known him long enough to recognize when he wasn't being completely honest with himself. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I thought winning would feel different." Marie arched a brow. "Winning? You know what I mean," he muttered. "I've done everything I set out to do. I reclaimed my work. I built something meaningful. I've helped people. But..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "But you still feel like something's missing?" David glanced at her, then gave a small nod. Marie leaned against the desk. "You spent your whole life fighting, David. First to survive, then to be seen, then to make a difference. Maybe you just don't know how to stop." He let out a quiet laugh, but deep down her words hit home. She was right. He didn't know what it meant to just exist without needing to prove something. For so long, his art had been about reclaiming power, telling his story, making sure no one could ever silence him again. But what would his art be now? Who was he without the fight? That question haunted him. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself restless. He attended meetings for the foundation, mentored young artists, and kept up appearances, but when he sat down to paint, nothing came. His hands hovered over the canvas, but the colors felt empty. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to create. The fear crept in quietly. Had he lost it? Had he poured everything into the truth and left nothing for himself? One evening, in the quiet of his studio, he went through his old sketchbooks, flipping through pages filled with his childhood dreams. He paused at the familiar image, the house, the rainbow, the innocent hope of a boy who had once believed in something bigger than himself. That's when it hit him. He had spent so much time reclaiming his past that he had never let himself dream of the future. He needed something new. Not another battle. Not another fight. Something purely his own. Marie found him in the studio the next morning, sitting in front of a completely blank canvas. She tilted her head. "You okay?" David smiled, a real, unburdened smile. "Yeah. I think I finally know what comes next." Marie smirked. "Care to share?" He picked up his brush, staring at the empty canvas with excitement for the first time in years. "I think I just want to paint." Marie chuckled. "Well, it's about time." David let out a deep breath and touched the brush to the canvas, letting the colors flow, not from pain, not from a need to prove himself, but simply because he loved it. And for the first time, that was enough. David's brush moved fluidly across the canvas, the colors blending in a way that felt different from anything he had ever painted before. For the first time in years, there was no burden behind each stroke, no weight of expectation or the need to prove something. This wasn't about reclaiming stolen dreams or fighting battles from his past. This was about creating for the sake of creating. Hours passed, but he barely noticed. For the first time in a long time, the silence of the studio wasn't oppressive. It wasn't loneliness, it was peace. He stepped back, looking at what he had made. It wasn't perfect, but that was the beauty of it. He hadn't painted to make a statement. He had painted because he wanted to. The next morning, Marie walked in with a stack of messages but stopped mid-step when she saw the new canvas. She stared at it for a long moment, then turned to David with a slow smile. "This feels different," she said. "It is." She nodded approvingly. "So, what now?" David considered the question. It had always been about what's next, always about the next fight, the next challenge, the next step forward. But for the first time, he wasn't rushing toward anything. "I don't know," he admitted. "And I think I'm okay with that." Marie smirked. "Well, that's a first." He chuckled, shaking his head. I spent my whole life fighting. I think I need to learn how to just be for a while." Marie sat down across from him. "So, no big projects? No grand exhibitions? No new mission?" David thought about it. He could easily throw himself into another foundation expansion, another headline-grabbing initiative. But deep down, he knew that wasn't what he needed. Not right now. "No," he said finally. "I think I just want to live for a bit." Marie studied him, then grinned. "Well, it's about damn time." They sat in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "There's a little gallery opening downtown," she said. "It's for emerging artists, people just starting out. Thought you might want to check it out?" David raised an eyebrow. "Are you trying to make me take on another project?" Marie shrugged. "I just think you might like seeing art through fresh eyes again." David considered it, then nodded. "Yeah, let's go." The gallery was small, tucked into a quiet street lined with bookstores and coffee shops. It reminded David of the places he had visited when he was just starting out, back when he had nothing but a sketchbook and a dream. Inside, the space was filled with the hum of conversation, people admiring the works of young, unknown artists. There was a rawness to the art here, a kind of unpolished beauty that came from pure passion. No pressure, no expectations, just people creating because they loved it. As he walked through the gallery, he paused in front of a small display tucked into the corner. The paintings were simple, rough around the edges, but full of emotion. He tilted his head, drawn to the way the artist had used color, not to impress, but to express. "This one's my favorite," a voice said beside him. David turned to see a young woman standing nearby, hands shoved into the pockets of her paint-stained jacket. She looked about 19, her dark curls pulled into a messy bun, eyes sharp with curiosity. "You're the artist?" he asked. She nodded. "Yeah. It's probably not the most technical piece here, but I don't really paint for technique." David smiled. "Neither do I." She blinked, recognition flickering in her expression. "Wait, you're David Markov?" He nodded. She laughed under her breath. "I've been following your work for years. Your paintings, they mean something. The way you tell stories through them, it's why I started painting in the first place." David felt something warm settle in his chest. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said. "Well, Sophie, your work is incredible." She scoffed. "I doubt that. I just paint what I feel. That's exactly why it's incredible." She studied him for a moment, then crossed her arms. "So, what brings a big-name artist like you to a tiny gallery like this?" David smirked. "Looking for reminders." "Reminders of what?" He glanced at her work again, at the passion behind every brushstroke. "Why I started." Sophie tilted her head. "And?" David smiled. "I think I just found it." That night, David sat in his studio, staring at a fresh canvas. But this time, he wasn't thinking about the past. For the first time in years, he was looking toward the future. And it felt like a brand new beginning. David sat in his studio, the glow of the city lights spilling through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. The fresh canvas in front of him felt different from the hundreds he had painted before. It wasn't a battlefield, wasn't a statement, wasn't a fight. It was simply a blank space full of possibility. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to reclaim something. He wasn't painting for survival, for justice, or even for recognition. He was painting because he wanted to. He picked up his brush, hesitated for only a moment, then let the first stroke land. It started with soft colors, something new for him. Light blues, warm golds, the gentle mix of hues that reminded him of a sunrise. For so long, his work had been defined by contrast, by darkness against light, by the tension of emotion. But now, he painted something that felt free. As the hours passed, he lost himself in the rhythm of the brushstrokes. He didn't stop to analyze, didn't pause to critique, he just created. The outside world faded, the weight of expectation melted away. By the time he stepped back, the painting was unlike anything he had ever done before. It was soft, hopeful, open, the kind of painting that felt like a deep breath after years of holding it in. A quiet knock pulled him from his thoughts. Marie leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him with a knowing smirk. "I take it you found your next masterpiece?" David chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a masterpiece. Just something different?" Marie stepped closer, taking in the canvas. Her expression shifted, the teasing glint in her eyes softening into something more thoughtful. "This one feels lighter," she said after a moment. David nodded. "Because it is." Marie looked at him, her smirk returning. "So, does this mean you're officially done with the whole tortured artist phase?" David laughed. "I think I've had enough of that for one lifetime." Marie grinned, then glanced at her watch. "Well, I hate to interrupt your creative rebirth, but Sophie's gallery is doing another showcase tonight. You up for it?" David hesitated. Not because he didn't want to go, but because for the first time in years, he wasn't chasing anything. He wasn't searching for answers, wasn't trying to find missing pieces of himself. But something told him this was exactly where he needed to be. "Yeah," he said, grabbing his coat. "Let's go." The gallery was buzzing with energy when they arrived. Unlike the pristine, high-end exhibitions David had grown accustomed to, this place was alive. People weren't here to impress one another, they were here for the art. Sophie spotted them from across the room, waving them over. She looked more confident this time, standing beside her work like she belonged there. "I was wondering if you'd show up," she said with a grin. David smirked. "Wouldn't miss it." She gestured toward a new piece she had on display, a vivid explosion of colors that somehow still felt intimate, personal. "What do you think?" she asked, a hint of nervousness beneath her casual tone. David studied it for a long moment. "I think it's incredible." Sophie exhaled, relief flashing across her face before she masked it with a smirk. Well, if David Markov says it's good, I guess I'm on the right track. David laughed. You don't need my validation. You're already doing exactly what you're supposed to. Sophie's gaze lingered on him for a second, as if measuring his words, then she nodded. Just then, one of the gallery's coordinators approached, excitement evident in her expression. Sophie, a collector just made an offer on your piece? Sophie's eyes widened. What? The coordinator grinned. Someone wants to buy it. A good price, too. David watched as pure disbelief and joy flickered across Sophie's face. She stumbled over her words before finally laughing. Well. Marie nudged David playfully. Look at that. You might have inspired the next great artist. David smirked, watching as Sophie processed the news. But deep down, he knew the truth. She had done this on her own. He had spent his life trying to reclaim something that had been stolen from him. Now, he was watching someone build something entirely new. And for the first time, that was enough. Later that night, as David walked home, the city around him felt different. He wasn't just another artist fighting for space in the world. He wasn't just the boy from the orphanage who had been told he'd never be anything. He was David Markov, a man who had painted his own path. A man who had nothing left to prove. A man who was finally, completely free. And as he stepped into his studio, looking at the blank canvas waiting for him, he realized something. This wasn't the end of his story. It was just the beginning. David stood in his studio, gazing at the blank canvas before him. But unlike before, there was no sense of urgency, no pressure to create something groundbreaking, no weight from the past pressing down on him. For the first time, he wasn't painting to reclaim something. He was painting because he could. He dipped his brush into a deep cerulean blue, letting the color glide across the canvas with an ease he hadn't felt in years. The strokes were deliberate but unrestrained, guided by nothing but instinct and the simple joy of creating. The past had shaped him, yes, but it no longer defined him. He had spent so long fighting to prove himself that he had never truly stopped to ask what he wanted beyond that fight. Now, standing in this quiet moment, he realized that he didn't need to prove anything anymore. He was an artist, a creator, and for the first time in a long time, he was painting without expectation. Hours passed unnoticed, lost in the rhythm of creation. The colors melded into each other, forming a soft but powerful image. It wasn't a statement piece, it wasn't revolutionary, it was his. A new chapter, a new beginning. Just as he set his brush down, there was a knock at the door. Marie. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at her lips. You do realize you've been in here all day, right? David chuckled, rolling his shoulders. That obvious? You missed dinner, she teased. Wasn't hungry. Marie stepped further inside, glancing at the painting in progress. She studied it for a moment, then nodded approvingly. This feels different? David exhaled, stepping back to admire his work. Because it is. She looked at him, her smirk softening into something more genuine. You finally let go, didn't you? David thought about it for a moment before nodding. Yeah, I think I did. Marie grinned. About damn time. They stood there in comfortable silence, looking at the canvas together. The weight of expectation, of proving himself, of fighting for recognition, all of it had finally faded. And in its place? Freedom. Pure, unfiltered freedom. Marie patted his shoulder. Come on, let's grab coffee. You can tell me all about how you're going to become a carefree artist now. David chuckled. Deal. As they left the studio, he took one last glance at his painting, a sense of peace settling over him. This wasn't an ending. This was just the beginning. David walked down the quiet city streets with Marie, the cool evening air brushing against his skin. The cafe they chose was a small one, tucked between an old bookstore and a music shop, the kind of place that had been there forever and didn't care about trends. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped inside, the rich scent of coffee and baked goods wrapping around them like a warm embrace. They found a corner table, away from the buzz of conversation. Marie ordered an espresso, as always, while David settled for a simple black coffee. No frills, no distractions, just something real. She tapped her fingers against the ceramic cup once their drinks arrived. So, what's the plan now? David let out a small chuckle. You always need a plan, don't you? Marie smirked. Of course. You're the one who spent years chasing closure and now, suddenly, you're at peace or whatever. She leaned forward, studying him. Doesn't feel weird? David exhaled, staring into the dark liquid in his cup. Yeah, a little. He looked up at her. I've never just existed before. Everything I did had a purpose, a reason. Now, I wake up and for the first time, I don't feel like I have to fight anymore. Marie tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. And what if you miss the fight? David considered that for a moment. The chase had been part of him for so long. Fighting for recognition, for justice, for the right to his own art. Without that, what was left? He took a sip of coffee, then smirked. Then I'll find something worth chasing. Marie nodded, satisfied. Good answer. The door to the cafe swung open, and a group of young artists filtered in, their voices full of excitement. One of them, a young man no older than 20, pulled out a sketchbook and started flipping through pages, showing something to his friends. The others leaned in, murmuring their approval. David watched them for a moment, something stirring in his chest. They remind you of someone? Marie asked, following his gaze. He smiled, nodding. Yeah, me. Marie leaned back. Then maybe you've already found your next chase? David glanced at her. She shrugged. You spent your whole life proving you belonged in this world. Now, maybe you help others do the same. The idea settled in his mind like a seed taking root. He had built his foundation, helped young artists, mentored where he could. But what if he went beyond that? What if he traveled, found young talent, taught in places that didn't have the luxury of artistic freedom? The more he thought about it, the more it felt. Right? Marie saw the look in his eyes and grinned. Oh no, you're plotting again. David chuckled. Guess I am. Where do you start? He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. Maybe small. Find someone who needs a mentor. Then go from there. Marie took another sip of her espresso, smirking. You're incapable of doing things small. David laughed. Yeah, well, we'll see. 2 weeks later, David found himself back at Sophie's gallery. It had become a quiet ritual, watching young artists put their work out into the world, remembering what it had felt like to stand in their place. Sophie spotted him and waved him over. She looked more confident than before, the nervous edge in her posture replaced by something steadier. You're making a habit of this, she teased. David shrugged. Guess I like seeing new talent. She grinned. Well, in that case, she gestured to a boy standing near a small display at the back of the gallery. That's Alex. 14. Just got into painting last year. His work is, well, just go see for yourself. David arched an eyebrow but made his way over. Alex stood awkwardly in front of his paintings, shifting from foot to foot as people passed by. His work was bold, unrefined, but bursting with emotion. The strokes were aggressive, the colors clashing in a way that somehow worked. David studied the pieces, then looked at the boy. You paint with a lot of energy. Alex flinched slightly, as if unsure whether that was a compliment or a criticism. Yeah, I guess. David nodded at one piece, a swirl of reds and blues, chaotic but compelling. What were you thinking about when you made this? Alex hesitated, then shrugged. I don't know. Just felt like this. David smirked. Then it's real. Alex's eyes flicked up, cautious. What? If it's what you felt, then it's real. And that's all that matters. The boy studied him, as if trying to figure out if he was serious. Then, slowly he nodded. Sophie appeared at David's side, whispering, he doesn't really talk about his work much. David smirked. Neither did I when I started. Alex looked between them. Are you David Markov? David grinned. Guilty. The boy's jaw dropped slightly. You're like famous? David chuckled. Something like that? Alex hesitated, then blurted out. Do you think my art is good? David didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the paintings, really looking at them. Then he nodded. I think it's honest. And that's better than good. Alex blinked. But it's not, like, professional or anything. David smirked. Neither was mine when I started. A small flicker of hope crossed the boy's face, quickly hidden. But David saw it. He recognized it. Sophie nudged him playfully. "I think you just made his year." David smiled, something clicking into place. Maybe this was the next chapter. Not proving himself. Not chasing validation. But helping others believe in themselves before the world told them otherwise. He turned back to Alex. "You ever want feedback or help, let me know." The boy's eyes widened. "For real?" David nodded. "For real?" Alex nodded quickly, as if afraid the offer might disappear if he didn't accept it fast enough. David smirked. "All right then. Let's see where this takes you." As he left the gallery that night, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Not just satisfaction. Not just peace. But purpose. David didn't waste time. The next morning, he reached out to Sophie, asking her to arrange a meeting with Alex. He had no formal plan, no structured mentorship program. He just knew that he wanted to help. Not just Alex, but other young artists who had no idea how to navigate the world that had once seemed impossible for him to break into. A few days later, Alex arrived at David's studio, hesitant at first, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie. His eyes darted around the space, taking in the canvases, the half-finished works, the shelves lined with sketchbooks and brushes. David could see it in his expression, awe, curiosity, but mostly doubt. "Welcome to the chaos," David said, gesturing to the scattered paints and unfinished canvases around the room. Alex huffed a quiet laugh. "It's not what I expected." David raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" The boy shrugged. "I don't know. Something more serious. Fancy. Professional." David smirked. "Art isn't always clean. Most of the time, it's messy. Kind of like life." Alex nodded, though he still looked uncertain. David picked up a blank canvas and set it in front of him. "All right, let's see what you've got." Alex blinked. "You mean like, now?" David chuckled. "No time like the present." Alex hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, rolling up the sleeves of his hoodie. His fingers hovered over the paint tubes before settling on a deep crimson red. David watched as he squeezed the paint onto the palette, his movements slow, deliberate. He was careful, too careful, like he was waiting for permission to make a mistake. "Forget about making it perfect," David said. "Just feel it." Alex let out a slow breath. Then, finally, he dipped the brush into the paint and dragged it across the canvas. The first stroke was tentative, but as the minutes passed, he loosened up. His movements became bolder, the colors more confident. David nodded approvingly. "There you go." Alex worked in silence for nearly an hour, fully absorbed in his creation. When he finally stepped back, he looked at David, waiting for a reaction. David studied the painting, a storm of colors, raw and emotional. It wasn't polished, but it was real. "This is good," David said. "It's honest." Alex frowned. "But it's kind of all over the place." David smirked. "So is life. Art isn't about making something neat and perfect. It's about saying something that only you can say." Alex tilted his head, considering. "I don't really know what I was saying with this." David nodded. "Then maybe you weren't saying something. Maybe you were feeling something." The boy looked at the canvas again, his lips pressing together. Then, after a moment, he nodded. David knew that look. It was the same one he had worn years ago, when he first realized what art could really be. Over the next few weeks, Alex returned to the studio regularly. What had started as an informal lesson quickly became a routine. Some days they painted in silence. Other days they talked about art, about life, about how hard it was to feel like you belonged somewhere. David never pried, never asked Alex about things the boy wasn't ready to share. But little by little, Alex opened up. "My parents didn't really get it," he admitted one afternoon, wiping paint from his hands. "They always thought art was a waste of time. My dad especially." David nodded. He had heard the same story from countless young artists. The world had a way of telling people that dreams weren't practical, that creativity wasn't a real career. "You're here anyway," David pointed out. Alex smirked. "Yeah, guess I am." For the first time, he said it with pride. One evening, David received an unexpected call. It was from Catherine. I hear you've got a new protege, she said. David chuckled. Word travels fast. You should think about expanding this, she continued. You're already mentoring kids through the foundation, but maybe it's time to take it to the next level. David leaned back in his chair. You think I should start a program? I think you already have, Catherine said. You're just the last one to realize it. David ran a hand through his hair, considering. He had started mentoring Alex without any real structure, but Catherine was right. He was already doing the work. And it felt right. Maybe this was the next step. Not just for Alex, but for all the young artists who didn't have someone to tell them they were good enough. The next day, David sat across from Alex at the studio, watching as the boy put the finishing touches on a new painting. I've been thinking, David said, about starting something more official. A mentorship program, maybe even a school. Alex glanced up, surprised. Like, for kids like me? David nodded. Exactly. Alex hesitated, then smirked. Does that mean I get to be the first graduate? David laughed. I guess it does. Alex leaned back, studying his painting. I think it's a good idea, he said after a moment. There are a lot of kids out there who need someone to tell them their art isn't useless. David's smile softened. Yeah, there are. And now he was going to be that someone. For them. For himself. For the kid he had once been.